Before we begin, if you enjoy wandering through the peculiar and often absurd corners of history with a dash of dark humor, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales like this one. Now, settle in for the first chapter of our story about a minstrel whose talents were, shall we say, unconventional. Chapter 1. The Audition That Never Was. The town of Harrow's End was not known for its musical prowess, nor for its tolerance of those who lacked it. Yet, on this particularly damp and unremarkable morning, a man named Edwin stood outside the Laughing Boar Tavern, clutching a lute he had never learned to play. His fingers, which had spent more time fumbling with bread crusts than plucking strings, twitched nervously against the instrument's neck. Inside the renowned, or at least moderately tolerated, Silver Strings minstrel troupe was holding auditions. Edwin had heard the call for new talent while nursing a tankard of ale the night before, and in the hazy glow of liquid courage he had convinced himself that this was his moment. The problem, of course, was that Edwin couldn't play a single note. Not on the lute, not on the flute, not even on the humble tambourine, which he had once attempted to shake rhythmically before an unimpressed dog. But Edwin had other qualities. He had enthusiasm, for one. He had a voice that could, if the listener was charitable, be described as distinctive. And most importantly, he had a boundless capacity for self-delusion. Pushing open the tavern door, Edwin was met with the sour scent of spilled beer and the discordant sounds of hopeful minstrels tuning their instruments. At a long table near the hearth sat the Silver Strings' three judges: Maribel, a sharp-eyed woman with a harp strapped to her back like a weapon; Gregor, a barrel-chested man whose fingers drummed impatiently on the table; and Oswin, the eldest, who looked as though he had been carved from a particularly weary piece of oak. Edwin's name was called far too soon. He stumbled forward, his lute emitting a hollow thunk as it bumped against a stool. The judges regarded him with varying degrees of skepticism. Oswin, at least, had the decency to yawn. "What will you be performing for us today?" Maribel asked, her voice drear than the tavern's bread. Edwin opened his mouth, then closed it. He had not considered this part. "A ballad," he declared, with more confidence than he felt. "A tale of love and loss of. Get on with it," Gregor interrupted. Edwin strummed the lute. The sound was less a melody, and more the auditory equivalent of a chair collapsing. The judges winced in unison. "Untimely," Edwin began to sing. His voice was not entirely unpleasant if one ignored the fact that it bore no resemblance to the notes he was attempting to mimic. The lyrics, which he improvised on the spot, told the story of a shepherd who lost his sheep, his wife, and eventually his will to live. It was, in Edwin's mind, a poignant commentary on the human condition. By the third verse, Oswin had rested his head on the table. Gregor massaged his temples, as if attempting to physically push the sound out of his skull. Only Maribel remained upright, her expression unreadable. When Edwin finished with a final dissonant strum, the silence that followed was thicker than the tavern stew. "Well," Maribel said at last, "that was certainly something." Gregor groaned. "That wasn't music. That was an assault on the very concept of sound." Edwin's face burned, but he stood his ground. "Art is subjective," he offered weakly. Oswin lifted his head just enough to mutter, "Not this subjective." Maribel sighed. "Tell me, Edwin, why do you want to be a minstrel?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected to be thrown out by now, possibly by force. "I suppose I want to make people feel something," he said. It was the closest thing to the truth he could manage. Gregor barked a laugh. "Oh, you made me feel something. Mostly regret." Maribel held up a hand. "Leave us," she said to Edwin. "We'll discuss." Edwin retreated to a shadowy corner of the tavern, where he nursed a cup of watery ale and tried not to overhear the judges' deliberations. Snatches of conversation drifted over, phrases like "never again" and possibly a public menace. When his name was called a second time, he approached the table with the grim resignation of a man walking to the gallows. Maribel folded her hands. "We've reached a decision." Edwin braced himself. "You," she said, "are the worst musician I have ever heard." Gregor nodded vigorously. Oswin made a noise that might have been agreement or the early stages of a nap. "But," Maribel continued, "you are also the most entertaining failure we've encountered in years. So here's our offer. You can travel with us as let's call it a cautionary tale. A living reminder of what not to do." Edwin blinked. "You're hiring me." "We're tolerating you," Gregor corrected, "for comedy's sake." And so, with no dignity but a shred of hope, Edwin the minstrel, who could not play a single instrument, joined the Silver Strings troupe. As he left the tavern that day, the lute slung awkwardly over his shoulder, he couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something. Whether it was greatness or disaster remained to be seen. Chapter 2. The Lyre of Lies. The life of a minstrel, Edwin quickly discovered, was not all feasts and adoring crowds. It was mostly blisters, sour wine, and the constant, gnawing fear of exposure. The Silver Strings troupe moved from town to town like a pack of well-dressed vagabonds, performing for merchants, drunkards, and the occasional indifferent noble who tossed coins as if they were scraps to a dog. And thus far, Edwin's role had been exactly as promised, a walking joke. He was permitted to sing badly during comedic interludes, and occasionally, when the ale flowed freely enough, the crowd even laughed with him instead of at him. But tonight was different. Tonight, they were performing at the estate of Lord Balfour, a man whose wealth was matched only by his reputation for impatience. And worse, Maribel had announced at breakfast that Edwin would be performing a solo. A solo? Edwin had repeated, his voice cracking. "Nothing elaborate," she said, tearing into a hunk of bread with her teeth. "Just a short ballad, something to pad the evening before Oswin's lute piece." Gregor, ever the comfort, had added, "If you ruin this for us, I'll throw you in the river myself." And so, as the troupe prepared in the draughty antechamber of Lord Balfour's hall, Edwin's mind raced for an escape. He could feign illness, but no, Gregor would see through that immediately. He could accidentally break his lute, but instruments were expensive, and his debt to the troupe was already staggering. Then, as he glanced at the ornate lyre resting on a nearby stool, inspiration struck. It was Oswin's lyre, a delicate thing carved with vines and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Edwin had never dared touch it. Oswin treated the instrument like a holy relic, and woe betide anyone who so much as breathed on it wrong, which made it perfect. When Maribel called for him to ready himself, Edwin took a deep breath and stepped forward, his face a mask of tragic remorse. I cannot perform," he announced. The troupe turned as one. Gregor's expression darkened like a storm cloud. "What?" Edwin lowered his eyes, summoning every ounce of shamelessness he possessed. "My instrument," he said, voice quivering. "My beloved lyre, it was stolen, just this morning, by highwaymen, or possibly a very determined goose. The details are still unclear." Gregor looked ready to strangle him. "You don't own a lyre." "I did," Edwin insisted. "A priceless heirloom passed down through generations of my family. It was the only thing of value I owned, and now it's gone." He pressed a hand to his heart. "I cannot bring myself to play another, not yet. The grief is too fresh." Maribel pinched the bridge of her nose. Oswin, who had been tuning his lute, paused to stare at Edwin with an expression of quiet horror. "You're lying," Gregor said flatly. Edwin gasped, affronted. Would I lie about such a tragedy? Would I dishonor the memory of my great-grandfather, who fought in the Crusades with this very lyre strapped to his back? "You've never mentioned a great-grandfather in the Crusades," Maribel said. "It was a painful subject," Edwin said solemnly. At that moment, a servant appeared to usher them into the hall. There was no more time for debate. Gregor shot Edwin a look that promised violence later, but Maribel, ever the pragmatist, simply sighed and said, "Fine, you're on crowd duty. Make sure no one throws anything at us." And so, Edwin spent the evening lurking at the edges of the performance, refilling wine cups and offering exaggerated compliments to Lord Balfour's guests. The plan had worked, mostly, until Lord Balfour himself, a gaunt man with a voice like rustling parchment, raised a hand and declared, "I hear there was to be a ballad tonight. Where's the minstrel who promised us song?" Silence fell. Every eye in the room turned toward Edwin. Even Gregor, mid-juggle, nearly dropped his knives. Edwin swallowed hard. Then, with the air of a man stepping onto the gallows, he stepped forward. "My lord," he said, bowing deeply, "alas, I am bereft. My instrument, my muse, my very soul has been torn from me by cruel fate. I cannot perform without it." Lord Balfour's brow furrowed. What instrument was this? "The lyre of St. Drogo," Edwin said, without hesitation. "A relic of untold power. Its strings were said to have been woven from the hair of angels. Its sound could mend broken hearts and, allegedly, cure gout." The nobleman leaned forward, intrigued. "And it was stolen." "By brigands," Edwin confirmed. "Or possibly a disgruntled squirrel. The investigation is ongoing." To his astonishment, Lord Balfour nodded gravely. "A tragedy indeed. Such a loss must be remedied." He snapped his fingers, and a servant hurried forward. "Fetch the minstrel a lyre from my collection. Let him play in memory of his stolen treasure." Edwin's blood turned to ice. The servant returned moments later, bearing a lyre nearly as fine as Oswin's. Edwin accepted it with numb fingers, his mind racing. There was no escape now. He sat on the stool provided, the weight of dozens of expectant stares pressing down on him. He plucked a string at random. The note rang out, clear and mocking. And so, with no other choice, Edwin began to play. The resulting sound was less music, and more the auditory equivalent of a cartwheel coming loose on a cobbled road. Notes clashed and died. Strings whined in protest. Lord Balfour's guests winced. Oswin looked physically ill. Yet Edwin played on, pouring every ounce of false confidence into his performance. He even sang, his voice wavering between keys, like a drunkard between taverns. The ballad he chose, improvised on the spot, told the tale of a man who lied so extravagantly that the gods turned his tongue to stone. It was, in hindsight, a poor thematic choice. When he finished, the hall was silent. Then, to Edwin's utter disbelief, Lord Balfour began to clap. Slowly. Deliberately. "Remarkable," the nobleman said. "I have never heard anything like it." Edwin dared to hope. "It was," Lord Balfour continued, "the single worst performance I have ever witnessed." Gregor buried his face in his hands. And yet the noble mused, "There's something compelling about such unfiltered incompetence. Minstrel, you will return next month. I wish to hear you again." Edwin blinked. "You do?" Lord Balfour smiled thinly. "It amuses me." As the troupe packed up that night, Maribel shook her head. "I don't know how you do it," she said. "You're like a cat that keeps falling out of trees and landing on its feet." Gregor, still seething, muttered, "More like a cockroach that survives being stepped on." Edwin, cradling the borrowed lyre like a stolen child, could only grin. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. And worse, he'd been invited back. The thought filled him with equal parts pride and dread. Chapter 3. A feast of false notes. Word of Edwin's disastrous, yet somehow successful. Performance at Lord Balfour's estate spread through the minstrel circuit like a bad smell. By the time the Silver Strings troupe reached the bustling city of Errand, even the street vendors had heard the tale of the tone-deaf minstrel who had somehow charmed nobility. This, Edwin realized with growing unease, was becoming a problem. Because now, people expected him to perform. The invitation to the royal banquet of Duke Caradoc had arrived on vellum edged in gold leaf, a detail that filled Edwin with both awe and existential dread. The Duke was known for two things, his lavish feasts and his violent temper. It was said he once had a juggler thrown into the moat for dropping a single pin. "We're doomed," Gregor muttered as they stood outside the ducal palace, its towering gates casting long shadows in the evening light. "Not necessarily," Maribel said, though even her usual stoicism seemed strained. "Just stick to the plan. Oswin opens with the lute piece, Gregor does the knife juggling, I'll handle the harp interlude, and Edwin—" "I'll stand very still in the back," Edwin offered. Maribel sighed. "Just don't draw attention to yourself." The great hall of the palace was a riot of color and noise. Nobles in silks and furs lounged at long tables, piled high with roasted meats, sugared fruits, and towering pies that smelled suspiciously of things Edwin didn't want to identify. The troupe was positioned near the minstrel's gallery, a raised alcove where they could be seen, but with any luck not heard too clearly. For the first hour things went surprisingly well. Oswin's lute playing was, as always, flawless. Gregor's knives flashed in the firelight without once embedding themselves in a guest. Even Edwin managed to blend into the background, occasionally humming under his breath, in a way that could almost pass for musical if no one listened too closely. Then came the fatal moment. Duke Caradoc, a bear of a man with a beard that could house small birds, slammed his goblet on the table and bellowed, "Enough of this pretty tinkling. I want to hear the one they talk about. The minstrel who plays like a cat in a sack." A hush fell over the hall. Edwin felt every eye in the room swing toward him. Even the roasted boar on the table seemed to glare accusingly. Maribel's foot nudged his ankle sharply. "Don't," she hissed under her breath. But the Duke was not a man who accepted silence. "Well," he demanded, "where is this musical marvel?" Edwin's mouth went dry. His fingers, which had been idly tapping on his knees, froze. There was no lying his way out of this. No stolen lyre, no conveniently missing instrument. Just the Duke's expectant stare and the sudden, crushing realization that his next performance might very well be his last. Then inspiration struck, or perhaps desperation. Edwin gasped dramatically, clutching his chest. "Oh no!" His voice wavered with what he hoped sounded like genuine distress. The vapors, the terrible, terrible vapors. He swayed on his stool, letting his eyes roll back in a way he'd once seen a particularly theatrical drunkard do, before collapsing into a horse trough. And then, with a flourish that would have made a tragedian proud, Edwin pitched forward off the stool and onto the floor with a thud that sent his lute skittering across the stones. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then chaos. "By the saints, he's died," someone cried. "Poison!" shrieked a noblewoman, immediately upending her wine cup. Gregor, to his credit, caught on instantly. "Clear the way," he bellowed, shoving through the crowd. "The man needs air, or a priest, possibly both." Maribel was less amused. She knelt beside Edwin, her voice a venomous whisper. "If you don't stop breathing so loudly, I will make you faint for real." Edwin, ever the professional, let out a pitiful moan for effect. Duke Caradoc loomed over them, his expression torn between concern and irritation. "What ails the man?" "A delicate constitution, my lord," Maribel said smoothly. "The rigors of travel, the richness of your feast. It has overwhelmed his humors." She pressed the back of her hand to Edwin's forehead with theatrical gravity. "Alas, I fear he may not recover in time to perform tonight." The Duke scowled. "Pah, I've seen stronger constitutions on week-old bread." but he waved a dismissive hand. "Take him to the kitchens. Let the scullions revive him. I'll not have a corpse at my table." And so, with Gregor hauling him up by the armpits and Maribel pinching his elbow hard enough to leave bruises, Edwin was half dragged, half carried out of the hall. The moment the doors closed behind them, he straightened up with a grin. "That," he announced, "was my best performance yet." Gregor dropped him. Edwin hit the floor with a yelp. "You," Gregor said through clenched teeth, "are going to get us all killed." But Maribel, after a long moment, rubbed her temples and muttered, "It worked, though." Back in the hall, the sound of Oswin's lute resumed, smooth and unhurried. The Duke's laughter boomed over the music. The crisis, it seemed, had been averted, at least until the next banquet. As Edwin dusted himself off, a scullion boy peered around the kitchen doorway, holding a ladle like a weapon. "You're the minstrel what fainted?" Edwin bowed. "The very same." The boy squinted. "You don't look faint." "Ah," Edwin said solemnly, "but that's the art of it." And with that, he strolled toward the kitchens, already rehearsing his next excuse. Chapter 4. The Bard Who Couldn't. The town of Malofin was renowned for two things: its annual turnip festival and its merciless scrutiny of traveling performers. It was here, beneath a sagging tavern sign depicting a leering goat, that the Silver Strings troupe encountered their first real competition. A minstrel who went by the name of Roland, the golden-throated. Roland was everything Edwin was not. His fingers danced across lute strings with effortless grace. His voice, rich and resonant, could make even the bawdiest tavern ballad sound like a sacred hymn. And, as Edwin quickly learned, he had a particular distaste for frauds. The trouble began the moment the troupe entered the boastful goat. Roland was mid-performance, weaving a tale of star-crossed lovers that had the entire room enraptured, until Oswin's lute case knocked over a tankard with a clatter. The music stopped. Every head turned, and Roland's sharp green eyes locked onto Edwin with the precision of a hawk, spotting a particularly plump mouse. "Ah," Roland said, his lips curling into a smile that did not reach his eyes. The infamous Edwin. Edwin, who had been inching toward the darkest corner of the room, froze. "You've heard of me?" "Oh, everyone has heard of you," Roland said, strumming a single mocking chord. "The minstrel who can't play a note, the bard who couldn't. Tell me, do you still blame highwaymen for your lack of talent? Or have you moved on to blaming squirrels?" Tavern erupted in laughter. Edwin's face burned, but he forced a grin. "Ah, but you see, my dear Roland, art is not merely about skilly. It's about passion." He thumped his chest dramatically. "And I, sir, am nothing if not passionate." Gregor groaned into his ale. Maribel looked as though she were considering strangling Edwin with his own lute strap. Roland arched a brow. "Is that so? Then perhaps you'd care to demonstrate this passion for us?" He held out his lute with a flourish. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer another tragic fainting spell." The room erupted into jeers and cheers. Edwin, realizing there was no escape short of setting himself on fire, took the lute with the grim determination of a man marching to the gallows. For a moment he simply stood there, weighing the instrument in his hands, as if expecting it to bite him. Then, with a deep breath, he began to play. The resulting noise was less music, and more the sound of a cat being dragged backward through a hedge. Strings screeched. Notes clashed like drunken swordsmen. A man in the front row actually covered his ears. Roland's smirk faltered, then vanished entirely as Edwin began to sing, if it could be called singing. His voice careened between keys like a runaway cart, his improvised lyrics telling the tale of a minstrel so bad that even deaf beggars threw coins at him to e-stock. "Dad!" To Edwin's shock, the crowd began to laugh. "Not rate him," Exactly. Though that was certainly part of it. But with him. They clapped along, howling as he leaned into the absurdity, plucking strings at random and warbling off-key with shameless enthusiasm. Roland's face darkened. This is an insult to the craft. Is it? Edwin gasped between verses. Or is it heartache? He struck a pose, one foot on a stool, the lute held aloft like a battle standard. Behold, the future of minstrelsy. The crowd roared. Tankards banged on tables. Even Maribel was hiding a smirk behind her hand. Roland, sensing his victory slipping away, snatched the lute back with a snarl. Enough, you're a disgrace. Edwin clutched his chest as if wounded. A disgracey? Or a visionary? The tavern exploded into chaos, half the crowd chanting Edwin's name, the other half booing. A turnip flew through the air, narrowly missing Roland's head. It was Gregor who finally stepped in, seizing Edwin by the collar and dragging him toward the door. Weary, he growled, before you start a riot. Outside, beneath a sky heavy with stars, Edwin grinned. Well, that went better than expected. Maribel sighed. One of these days, Edwin, your luck is going to run out. But not today, Edwin said, tossing a stolen turnip into the air and catching it with a flourish. Today, I am Shibulavidi. And with that, he strolled into the night, the sound of Roland's furious lute playing fading behind him. Chapter 5. The Juggler's Gambit. The aftermath of the Malafin debacle left Edwin with two important realizations. First, that his reputation as the worst minstrel in the realm was now inescapable, and second, that he needed a new gimmick. Fast, totumdi. Gregor had spent the entire next morning sharpening his knives, while staring at Edwin with unsettling intensity. Maribel had taken to sighing every time Edwin so much as opened his mouth. Even Oswin, normally as expressive as a moss-covered rock, had muttered something about career changes under his breath. And so, as the troupe rolled into the merchant town of Briar's Hollow, Edwin made his decision. If he couldn't be a musician, he would become something even more impressive. A juggler. How hard can it be? He asked aloud as he pilfered 3 apples from a market stall. You just throw things, and then catch them. Repeatedly. The first apple hit him square between the eyes. The second landed in a nearby rain barrel with a plop. The third never left his hand because at that moment he noticed the merchant glaring at him, one hand resting on a very large cudgel. Edwin offered an apologetic grin and carefully placed the apple back on the pile before backing away slowly. Undeterred, he spent the afternoon practicing with river stones behind the inn where the troupe was staying. His first attempt sent a rock crashing through the kitchen window. The second nearly brained a chicken. The third somehow ended up in his own boot. You're going to get us kicked out before we even perform, Gregor said, watching from the fence with arms crossed. Nonsense. Edwin picked up the stones again with renewed determination. All great artists struggle at first. Didn't you, when you began juggling? Gregor's mouth twitched. I nearly took my own ear off with a dagger on my first try. There, you see? That's not the encouragement you think it is. By nightfall, Edwin had progressed from actively dangerous to merely disastrous. He could now keep 2 stones in the air for several seconds before one inevitably struck him in the forehead or disappeared into the bushes. It was progress, he told himself, of a sort. When the time came for the troupe's evening performance at Briar's Hollow's central square, Edwin insisted on being included in the juggling act. No, Gregor said flatly. Absolutely not, Maribel agreed. I'll do it quietly, Edwin pleaded. No one will even notice me. That, Oswin rumbled, has never been true. But Edwin could be stubborn when properly motivated, and the memory of Roland's mocking grin was fresh in his mind. And so, as Gregor began his knife-juggling routine to the crowd's delighted gasps, Edwin crept onto the edge of the makeshift stage with 3 small leather balls he'd borrowed, without asking, from a child in the front row. For one shining moment, it almost worked. The first toss went smoothly. The second, miraculously, found his waiting hand. The third ball sailed over his head and directly into Gregor's face. Time seemed to slow. The crowd gasped. Gregor, mid-juggle with 5 gleaming blades, blinked in disbelief as the leather ball bounced off his nose. His hands faltered. What followed was less a juggling display and more an impromptu demonstration of how quickly trained performers could dive for cover. Knives clattered to the stage. Oswin yanked Maribel behind a market stall. The crowd screamed and scattered as Gregor's blades embedded themselves in the wooden stage in a perfect fan around Edwin, who stood frozen with his hands still raised in a catching position. Silence fell. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single slow clap. Edwin turned to see the mayor of Briar's Hollow, standing with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Well," the man said, "that was certainly something." Gregor, retrieving his knives with deliberate calm, said nothing. But the way he tested the edge of one blade while staring at Edwin spoke volumes. Maribel stepped forward, her professional smile strained. "Ahem. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, even the most skilled performers occasionally improvise." The crowd, recovering from their terror, began to murmur. Then, to Edwin's astonishment, someone chuckled. Then another. Soon the square was filled with laughter, people slapping their knees and wiping tears from their eyes. "Did you see his face?" a woman cackled. "I thought we were all going to die," a man wheezed. Edwin, sensing an opportunity, bowed deeply. "A new art form," he declared. Danger juggling, thrilled to the spectacle of near-death experiences. Gregor sheathed his last knife with a sharp click. "I'm going to murder you in your sleep." But the damage, or in this case the unexpected success, was done. By the time the troupe packed up, the townsfolk were still laughing, tossing coins into their hat with remarks like "come back soon," and "next time bring a physician." That night at the inn, as Edwin counted their unexpectedly hefty earnings, even Maribel couldn't maintain her glare. "You realize," she said, "that we can never do that again. Gregor would actually kill you." Edwin grinned, tossing a coin in the air. It landed neatly in his pocket. "Who needs music when you have a cheap performance RTE?" Gregor, sharpening his knives at the table, didn't look up. "I'm keeping one eye open tonight, just in case." And as Edwin retired to his straw pallet, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of accomplishment. True, he couldn't play music. True, he couldn't juggle. But somehow, against all odds, he'd stumbled upon a third option, being so spectacularly bad that it circled back around to entertaining. It wasn't the career he'd imagined. But as he drifted off to sleep to the sound of Gregor muttering darkly about amateur hour, Edwin decided it was better than nothing. After all, there were always more towns, more crowds, and surely, in somewhere out there, was an art form he wouldn't completely ruin. Probably. Chapter 6. The Ballad of Broken Strings. The morning after the juggling catastrophe dawned with 2 revelations. First, that Gregor had not in fact murdered Edwin in his sleep, and second, that Oswin's prized lute was missing. The troupe stood in horrified silence as Oswin's normally placid face twisted through stages of grief, usually reserved for widows and bankrupt merchants. "It was here," Oswin said in a voice like grinding millstones, pointing to the empty space beside his bedroll. "Beside my head, all night." Edwin, who had been admiring his unstabbed reflection in a puddle, suddenly found all eyes upon him. "Now wait just a moment," he protested. "I may be many things, but I'm not a lute thief." Maribel rubbed her temples. "You're the only one who benefits from it going missing." "Technically," Edwin countered, "we all benefit when I don't play it." A search of the inn revealed nothing, except that the landlord's daughter had suspiciously red eyes and a sudden interest in music lessons. The trail went cold at the edge of town, where the road forked toward the wealthy merchant city of Velen. "Velen it is then," Gregor said, hefting his pack. "And when we find that Lute, Oswin gets to decide whether we sell Edwin to the salt mines or just leave him tied up for wolves." Velen's towering gates gleamed with freshly polished brass, a testament to the city's obsession with appearances. The streets teemed with merchants hawking silks, spices, and instruments so expensive they came with their own armed guards. It was here, outside a music shop displaying an array of lutes behind iron bars, that fortune smiled upon them. There, Oswin pointed to a second-story window where a familiar pearwood lute sat propped on a velvet cushion. The sign below read, "Rare musical treasures, inquire within." The shop's interior smelled of lemon oil and desperation. A thin man with fingers like spider legs looked up from polishing a viol. "Ah, patrons, you've come to admire my newest acquisition. A genuine Oswin's lute, played by the master himself." Oswin's fist clenched. "I am Oswin." The shopkeeper's smile didn't waver. "How remarkable. Then you'll be able to authenticate it by playing something." Silence fell. Oswin, who had not spoken more than 3 words at a time in living memory, turned purple. Edwin saw disaster looming, and did what he did best. Threw himself into it head first. "My good man." Edwin swept forward, nearly toppling a display of flutes. "We are indeed here to authenticate this instrument. But first, might we examine it? In private? For artistic reasons." The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed. 50 silver pieces deposit. Gregor's knife found its way into his hand. "Or we could." "Wonderful idea." Edwin slapped down a coin purse containing precisely 3 coppers and a button. "We'll just be a moment." The back room was cramped and smelled of moldy sheet music. Oswin cradled the lute like a lost child while Maribel kept watch at the door. "We could just leave," she muttered. "Right now. Out the back." Edwin shook his head. "And miss the opportunity for a dramatic exit? Besides, he's seen our faces." He plucked a string experimentally. It snapped with a twang that seemed to hang in the air like an omen. Oswin made a noise usually only heard from dying stags. "Right," Edwin said quickly. "No touching." He peered out the curtained window to the street below. "I have a plan." The plan, like all Edwin's plans, relied heavily on luck and other people's poor decision-making. It began with him strolling back into the shop wearing Oswin's cloak, and the lute strapped across his back. "My good man," he announced, "this is unquestionably the finest instrument I've ever played. I must demonstrate it for the crowd outside." The shopkeeper frowned. "You haven't paid." But Edwin was already through the door, bellowing, "Gather round. Witness a musical marvel." A crowd began to form, drawn by the spectacle and the vague promise of free entertainment. What happened next unfolded with the inevitability of an avalanche. Edwin's first drum produced a sound like a stepped-on cat. The second sent 3 strings whipping loose. The third coincided with the headstock snapping clean off as the lute, perhaps sensing the abuse to come, chose self-destruction. Pieces rained down on the cobblestones. The crowd gasped. The shopkeeper screamed. Oswin fainted directly into Gregor's arms. Edwin surveyed the wreckage. "Ah," he said. "As I suspected, a counterfeit." He turned to the horrified shopkeeper. A real Oswin's lute would never break under the hands of a master. The shopkeeper gaped. You. "Precisely." Edwin doffed an imaginary hat. "Good day, sir." They made it 2 streets over before collapsing behind a tanner's shop, Oswin cradling the lute's remains like a fallen comrade. Maribel was the first to speak. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen." Gregor nodded. "I'm almost impressed. Oswin examined the broken instrument, then did something no one expected. He laughed. A deep, rumbling sound that shook his entire frame. The look, he wheezed, on that man's face. Edwin grinned. See, not such a bad ending after all. Gregor sheathed his knives. We still have to leave town before sunset. That shopkeeper has friends in the city guard. As they slipped out through the tanner's back alley, Edwin couldn't resist plucking one remaining string on the broken lute. It pinged off a nearby wall and hit Gregor squarely in the ear. Somewhere in the distance, a city bell began to toll. Or perhaps it was just another instrument giving up. Chapter 7. The Silent Serenade. The destruction of Oswin's lute had unexpected consequences. Without an instrument to shame himself upon, Edwin found himself at loose ends. The troupe's performances continued smoothly. Maribel's harp sang, Gregor's knives flashed, even Oswin had taken up a borrowed fiddle with surprising competence, while Edwin stood at the back, nodding along like an over-enthusiastic footman. This state of affairs lasted exactly 3 days before Edwin could no longer bear his own irrelevance. "It's not fair," he announced to no one in particular, as they trudged along the muddy road to Wexford. "I am being sidelined, marginalized, artistically repressed." Gregor didn't look up from sharpening his throwing daggers. "You could always try not being terrible." "Ha!" Edwin threw his arms wide, nearly smacking a passing donkey. "That's exactly the kind of conventional thinking that holds back true innovation." He stopped walking, struck by sudden inspiration. What if music isn't about instruments at all? What if the purest form is the human voice alone? Maribel paused. "You mean singing?" "No, well, yes, but not as you know it." Edwin tapped his temple. "I'm talking about something subtler, more avant-garde." Oswin, who had been silent for 3 miles, spoke without turning. "This will end badly." Rexford's town square boasted an actual raised wooden platform for performers, a luxury the troupe usually only encountered in larger cities. As they set up, Edwin paced behind the makeshift curtain, humming under his breath and occasionally striking dramatic poses to test their effect. "Whatever you're planning," Maribel warned as she tuned her harp, "don't trust the process," Edwin said, adjusting his sleeves with great ceremony. "What is art but risk made manifest?" Gregor rolled his eyes so hard it looked painful. When the performance began, everything proceeded normally at first. Maribel played a haunting ballad. Gregor juggled flaming torches. Oswin coaxed a surprisingly lively tune from his borrowed fiddle. Then, as the crowd buzzed with appreciation, Edwin stepped forward. "Good people of Wexford," he declared, spreading his arms. "You are about to witness a revolution in musical performance, a stripping away of all pretense. I give you the Silent Serenade." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to hum. The sound that emerged was neither melodic nor rhythmic. It wavered between keys like a drunkard between taverns, occasionally dipping into tones that made small children cover their ears. Edwin, lost in his performance, swayed with emotion, his humming growing louder and more discordant. A merchant in the front row frowned. Is he doing magic?" Edwin peeked with a sustained note that vibrated his entire face. Someone's dog began howling in sympathy. The town magistrate, a thin man with the patience of a startled badger, stood abruptly. "This is an outrage. You call this entertainment?" Edwin paused mid-hum. "It's minimalist. The Dutch are very into it. Get down from there before I have you arrested for disturbing the peace." Gregor, who had been watching with horrified fascination, stepped forward. "He's done. Finished. Never again." He grabbed Edwin by the collar and dragged him off stage as the crowd hurled rotten vegetables in their general direction. Back at their camp outside town, Edwin nursed a bruised ego and an actual bruise where a particularly well-aimed turnip had struck his shoulder. "Philistines," he muttered. "No appreciation for groundbreaking art." Maribel counted their meager earnings, several copper coins, and what appeared to be a button. "We can't keep doing this. We're one bad performance away from being run out of the country." Oswin plucked a single mournful note on his fiddle. "Horse farm?" Everyone turned. It was the most words Oswin had strung together in months. Gregor blinked. "What?" "His uncle's horse farm." Oswin nodded toward Edwin. "You said they needed help with the foaling season." Edwin sat up sharply. "You can't be serious. Me? Mucking stables?" Maribe's eyes lit up. "It's perfect. You'd be out of trouble. We'd make actual money for once." "But I'm an artist," Edwin protested. Gregor tossed a saddlebag at him. "You're something, all right." As the fire crackled, Edwin stared into the flames, contemplating a future of hay and horse manure. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang, perfectly in tune, the traitor. Perhaps, he thought, there were worse fates than obscurity. At least horses didn't throw vegetables. And with that thought, the great minstrel Edwin, he of the broken strings and shattered dreams, began to plot his next career, one far removed from music, audiences, and any form of public humiliation. Probably. Chapter 8. The Drunkard's Encore. The horse farm never stood a chance. Edwin's brief foray into agricultural employment lasted exactly one afternoon. The time it took for him to get kicked by a mare, trample a vegetable patch, and somehow lock himself in the grain silo. When the farmer finally cut him loose with wages consisting of a single turnip and a stern warning never to return, Edwin found himself back on the road with the Silver Strings troupe, who had not so much as slowed their wagons upon his departure. "You're like a bad copper," Gregor grumbled as Edwin caught up to them outside Milford. "No matter how many times you're spent, you keep turning up." Edwin, happily gnawing on his turnip, chose to take this as a compliment. By nightfall they reached the bustling market town of Harrow's Hollow, where the tavern, the Tipsy Archbishop, boasted both clean straw and a reputation for terrible standards in entertainment. The troupe's performance that night went smoothly enough. Maribel's harp playing drew sighs, Gregor's knife-throwing drew gasps, and Oswin's fiddle playing drew actual coins. Then came Edwin's turn. He had planned to sit quietly in the corner, perhaps heckle gently from the audience, but fate, and the tavern's strong ale, had other plans. "Another round for the musicians," bellowed a red-faced merchant, slamming his tankard on the table. "Especially the funny one." He pointed directly at Edwin. Edwin, who had been in the process of quietly stealing Gregor's untouched ale, froze. "Who? Me?" "The crowd has spoken," Maribel said with the air of a woman watching a ship sink from a safe distance. And so Edwin found himself propelled onto the makeshift stage, blinking under the smoky torchlight, his head pleasantly fogged by drink. He reached for a lute someone had left propped against a barrel, then thought better of it. Strings had never been his friends. Instead, he cleared his throat and launched into what he believed to be a rousing rendition of the Ballad of One-Eyed Jack, a drinking song so vulgar most taverns banned it. What emerged bore only passing resemblance to the original. His voice cracked spectacularly on the high notes. He forgot entire verses, replacing them with hummed approximations and improvised lyrics about a mule named Beatrice. His sense of rhythm was, as always, more suggestion than rule. Yet, as he staggered through the performance, something miraculous happened. The crowd began to cheer. "By the gods, he's brilliant!" shouted a wool merchant, wiping tears from his eyes. "Never seen a man so drunk still standing," agreed a washerwoman, pounding the table in delight. Edwin, sensing an opportunity, leaned into the bit. He swayed dramatically. He missed the stool and sat on the floor instead. He attempted to play an invisible lute with such conviction that several audience members later swore they'd seen one. The crowd roared with laughter, tossing coins and bits of bread like he was the second coming of some drunken saint. When he finally collapsed off the stage, a move that was only partially intentional, The tavern keeper rushed over, hauling him up by the armpits. "That," the man declared, breath reeking of onions, "was the best performance we've had in years. You're booked for tomorrow night." Edwin, still trying to remember which way was up, grinned. "Am I?" Maribel's grip on his elbow turned vice-like. He'd be honored. Back in their rented loft above the stables, Edwin basked in the glow of unexpected success while the others counted their earnings. "See," he said, waving a chicken leg like a scepter. "All I needed was the right audience." Gregor scowled. "They think you were drunk." "I was. They think it was part of the act." Edwin considered this. Even better. Oswin, who rarely participated in these discussions, spoke without looking up from mending a sock. "Problem?" They turned. "Can't get drunk tomorrow," he said simply. Silence fell. Edwin's smile faded. He looked down at the chicken leg, then at the coin purse overflowing with copper, then at Maribel's expression of dawning horror. "Oh," he said. The realization settled like a hangover. Somehow, against all odds, he had finally succeeded. And now he had to do it again. The tipsy archbishop's patrons would be expecting brilliance. They would be expecting hilarity. They would be expecting a drunk. And Edwin, for perhaps the first time in his life, was stone-cold sober. Chapter 9. The Traveling Mime Experiment. The disastrous success of Edwin's drunken performance at the tipsy archbishop had left him with a problem. He had no idea how to replicate it sober. The tavern crowd would be expecting the same stumbling, slurring brilliance, and Edwin knew that without several pints of courage he was just a man, fumbling on stage with no discernible talent. Thus, in a moment of what he considered unparalleled genius, Edwin arrived at his next great idea. If he couldn't play music, and he couldn't fake drunkenness, perhaps he could simply stop making noise altogether. "Gentlemen," he announced to the troupe over breakfast, "I've decided to become a mime." Gregor choked on his porridge. Oswin slowly set down his spoon. Maribel merely stared at him with the quiet resignation of a woman who had long since accepted that life was a series of increasingly bizarre trials. "You," Gregor wheezed, "can't even stand silently without causing a scene." "Nonsense." Edwin flourished an imaginary cape. "Miming is the purest form of theater. No instruments, no singing, just expressive silence." Oswin, who had personal experience with expressive silence, rubbed his temples. Maribel sighed. "Let me guess, you've already told the tavern keeper about this." Edwin grinned. He was very excited. That evening, the tipsy archbishop was packed. Word had spread about the drunken minstrel, and the crowd was rowdy, eager for another spectacle. Edwin, clad in hastily acquired whiteface, which, due to a shortage of proper mime supplies, was actually just flour mixed with lard, waited behind the curtain with nerves unsteady enough that he briefly considered drinking after all. Then his name was called. The moment Edwin stepped onto the stage, the crowd's murmurs turned to confused silence. He had expected this. Mimes were rare this far north, so he launched into his first routine. "Whitey invisible wall." He pressed his palms against nothing, feigned shock at its solidity, then attempted to climb over it. Somewhere in the back, a man muttered, "Is he having a fit?" Undeterred, Edwin moved on to Ye Trapped in a Box. He knocked on unseen surfaces, pushed against imaginary barriers, and even mimed, searching for a latch. The silence stretched. A child in the front row started crying. Then Edwin made his fatal mistake. Attempting a rope pull, he yanked so enthusiastically on his non-existent tether that he lost his balance, stumbled backward, and crashed directly into a serving girl carrying a tray of ale. The resulting chaos was, in its way, spectacular. Marks shattered. Alish braid in white, frothy arcs. The serving girl shrieked and flailed, knocking over a nearby patron who in turn upended a table. By the time Edwin regained his footing, half the tavern was either slipping in spilled drink or shouting in outrage. The tavern keeper, face purple with fury, seized Edwin by his flour-dusted collar. What in the nine hells was that? Modern performance art? Edwin offered weakly. Gregor, already packing their things, shot him a look that promised violence later. Maribel was already at the door, tossing coins to the serving girl in apology. Oswin had simply vanished, a trick Edwin wished he could learn. They fled into the night, the angry shouts of the tavern crowd fading behind them. Once safely on the road, Edwin wiped the last of his Mime makeup off with his sleeve and sighed. "Well," he said, "I think we can all agree that went better than expected." Gregor's knife slipped from his belt into his hand with practiced ease. Edwin cleared his throat. "Or perhaps not." Maribel shook her head. "We've been banned from 7 towns in 3 months. At this rate, we'll run out of the kingdom before winter." Oswin, reappearing from the shadows like a particularly grumpy ghost, muttered, "Could try honesty." The others turned to stare. Edwin gasped. "Oswin, that's the most words you've ever said at once." Gregor scratched his chin. "He's got a point, though. Maybe instead of pretending to be something you're not, you just admit you're terrible." Edwin clutched his chest as if wounded. "But where's the art in that?" Maribel groaned. "The art is in the survival. We're running out of roads to flee down." As they trudged onward beneath a sky heavy with stars, Edwin considered this. Perhaps there was something to be said for embracing failure. After all, he was clearly exceptional at it. And so, with the resilience of a man who had been thrown out of better places than this, Edwin began plotting his next disaster. Somewhere, a dog howled. Whether in sympathy or warning, it was hard to say. Chapter 10. The King's Fool's Errand. The royal summons arrived just as the troupe was packing up after another disastrous performance. This time, in the market square of Belgrath, where Edwin's attempt at fire-breathing, using nothing but a mouthful of flour and badly timed exhalations, had resulted in a baker's stall being temporarily engulfed in what appeared to be a localized blizzard. A liveried messenger on a sweaty horse thrust a scroll into Maribel's hands, gasped something about His Majesty's command, and galloped away before anyone could ask questions. Gregor squinted at the wax seal. "This is the royal crest." Oswin made a noise like a deflating bellows. Edwin, still picking flour from his teeth, brightened. "Perhaps our fortunes are turning." The summons, as it turned out, was not for the Silver Strings troupe. It was specifically for the jester who performed in Belgrath Square. Edwin beamed. "They mean me." Maribel rubbed her temples. "They mistook you for a jester." Same difference. The royal palace loomed over the capital like a disapproving parent, all sharp spires and narrow windows that seemed to watch their approach with thinly veiled disdain. The guards at the gate took one look at Edwin's flower-streaked tunic and mismatched boots and waved him through without question. A fact that should have been concerning but which Edwin took as a compliment. The throne room was a cavern of marble and tapestries, the air thick with the scent of incense and political tension. King Aldrich the Unamused, so called because no one could recall ever seeing him smile, sat slumped on his throne, chin propped on one jeweled hand, looking as though he regretted every decision that had led him to this moment. "You," the king said, pointing a lazy finger at Edwin, "make me laugh." Edwin blinked. "Right now?" The king's expression suggested that if he had to repeat himself, someone would lose a head. Edwin swallowed hard. He had no props, no prepared material, nothing but his wits and a lingering cough from all that flour. And so he did what he did best. He improvised. What followed was less a comedy routine and more a series of increasingly desperate physical gags. He tripped over his own feet, only partially intentional. He attempted to juggle some nearby fruit. A pear hit a duchess in the face. He minded getting stuck in an invisible barrel, which somehow turned into an actual struggle with his own belt. The court watched in stunned silence. Then, just as Edwin was considering feigning death to escape, the unthinkable happened. King Aldrich snorted. It was a small, choked sound, barely audible over the rustle of silk and the clink of goblets. But it was unmistakable. The king's lips twitched. His shoulders shook. And then, to the shock of everyone present, he burst into deep, wheezing laughter. The court erupted into applause, less because Edwin was funny and more because surviving the week required appearing to share the king's sense of humor. "You," the king gasped, wiping his eyes, "are the worst fool I've ever seen." Edwin bowed. "Your Majesty is too kind. Stay. Become my court jester." The words hung in the air like a noose. Maribel, who had been watching from the sidelines, made a small, strangled noise. Gregor looked torn between relief at being rid of Edwin and concern for the kingdom's future. Oswin simply stared into the middle distance, possibly contemplating treason. Edwin hesitated. It was a steady position. Good pay. No more running from angry mobs. But then he thought of the road, of the troupe, of the glorious uncertainty of each new disaster. He thought of Gregor's grudging camaraderie, and Maribel's exasperated sighs, and Oswin's quiet, terrifying competence. He thought of freedom. "Your Majesty honors me," Edwin said, bowing again. "But I fear my art thrives on unpredictability." The king's smile faded. "You refuse?" Edwin glanced at his friends, then back at the throne. "Let's just say I'd make a terrible employee." For a long moment, no one breathed. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the king chuckled. "Fair enough, but you'll perform for us tonight before you go. And it had better be funny." As they were ushered out to prepare, Maribel grabbed Edwin's arm. "That was either the bravest or stupidest thing you've ever done." Gregor nodded. "Definitely stupid." Oswin said nothing, but for the first time in living memory, he clapped Edwin on the back. That night, Edwin gave the performance of his life. Not because it was good, but because it was cheese. He sang off-key. He told terrible jokes. He tripped over the hem of his borrowed jester's motley and took out a candelabra. And the king laughed until he cried. As they left the palace at dawn, their pockets heavy with coin and Edwin's head pounding from celebratory wine, Gregor sighed. "You realize we're back to square one, right?" Edwin grinned, adjusting his lopsided jester's hat. "Isn't it wonderful?" And with that, the worst minstrel in the realm strode into the sunrise, his friends at his side, and disaster no doubt waiting just around the bend. Chapter 11. The Lute Teacher's Lament. The town of Briarswell was famous for three things: its foul-smelling sulfur springs, its aggressively optimistic mayor, and, most importantly, the renowned lute master Alaric the Patient. Edwin had heard tales of Alaric's legendary tolerance for incompetence, how he had once taught a tone-deaf baron's son for an entire summer without once throwing the boy into the river. This, Edwin decided, was exactly the kind of saintly forbearance his musical aspirations required. "I don't know about this," Maribel muttered as they approached the small cottage where Alaric gave lessons. The sweet sound of a well-played lute drifted through the open window. "Nonsense." Edwin adjusted the borrowed lute on his back. Oswin had flat-out refused to lend his again, so Edwin had acquired one from a distracted merchant's cart. "All I needed is proper instruction. You'll see. By week's end, I'll be performing ballads with the best of them." Gregor snorted. "I believe that when pigs fly out of my—" The cottage door swung open before he could finish. Alaric the Patient was a small, round man with the gentle demeanor of a man who had long since accepted that life was full of disappointments. His smile was warm, if slightly strained at the edges. "Ah," he said, taking in Edwin's hopeful expression and the way the lute hung from his shoulder like a dead animal. "You must be the new student." Within minutes of the lesson's start, Alaric's famous patience was being tested in ways even he had never imagined. First, the lute master said, "We must ensure you are holding the instrument correctly." Edwin frowned at the lute in his lap. "Like this?" "No, that's a mandolin position." "Ah, this? You're holding it upside down." "Aha, now?" Alaric closed his eyes briefly. "That's a chair." Edwin looked down at the chair he was now inexplicably cradling like a lute. Tricky things, lutes. Somehow they progressed to actual playing. Alaric demonstrated a simple scale, his fingers moving with practiced ease. "Now you try." Edwin did. The sound that emerged was less a scale, and more the noise of a dying seagull being stepped on. A nearby dog began howling. Alaric's left eye developed a noticeable twitch. "Perhaps," the lute master said very carefully, "we should start with something even simpler." 2 hours later, Alaric the patient was no longer living up to his name. His hands shook. His normally placid expression had taken on a wild, haunted look. Edwin, meanwhile, had successfully managed to play 3 notes in something resembling the correct order, though the 4th note had somehow caused 2 strings to snap and a small decorative vase to shatter on the other side of the room. "I think I'm improving," Edwin announced cheerfully. Alaric stared at him, then at the lute, then at the door, as if calculating how quickly he could escape. "My friend," he said, voice strained, "have you ever considered another profession, any other profession? Blacksmithing, perhaps, or monastic silence?" Edwin gasped, clutching his chest. "You're giving up on me." Alaric opened his mouth, closed it, then reached into his coin purse and pressed several silver pieces into Edwin's hand. "Here." Edwin blinked. "Is this payment for the lesson?" "No," Alaric said, walking him firmly to the door. "This is payment for you to never take another lesson again, from anyone, ever, for the good of the realm." Outside, Maribel and Gregor took one look at Edwin's face and the lute now missing half its strings and immediately deduced what had happened. Gregor smirked. "How long did he last?" 2 hours and 17 minutes, Edwin said, counting his coins. "A new record, I believe." Maribel sighed. "We're running out of lute masters." Oswin, who had been leaning against a nearby tree, straightened. "Countryside," he said gruffly. They turned. "For your musicians," he elaborated. "For your witnesses." Edwin beamed. "Oswin, that's brilliant. We'll take my musical talents to the rural folk. They're starved for entertainment. They won't care about a few missing notes." Gregor muttered something under his breath about villages with pitchforks. And so, with yet another failed endeavor behind him, and a lute that was now more kindling than instrument, Edwin set off down the road, already composing his next disaster in his head. Somewhere in the distance, a lone lute string twanged in the breeze. Whether in farewell or warning, it was hard to say. Chapter 12. The Miracle of Muffled Strings. The village of Green Hollow boasted 3 notable features: a suspiciously crooked inn, a goat that seemed to judge all who passed, and, most importantly, an audience that had not yet heard Edwin play. It was here, beneath the sagging beams of the Crooked Pint, that Edwin made his latest musical discovery. He had been attempting to tune his battered lute, now missing 3 strings, and decorated with an ominous crack down the soundboard, when a serving wench tossed a bar rag at his head. "For the love of mercy," she snapped, "wrap that thing up before you scare the cows again." Edwin, never one to ignore even the most hostile advice, examined the rag. Then he examined the gaping hole in his lute where the sound hole used to be. Then, with the dawning wonder of a man stumbling upon fire for the first time, he stuffed the cloth inside the instrument. The effect was revelatory. When he plucked a string, the note emerged muffled, distant, as if the lute were playing from the bottom of a well. The usual screeching overtones were dampened into something that, while still unpleasant, at least no longer made dogs howl in existential despair. "Maribel," Edwin gasped, bursting into the stable where the troupe slept. "I've done it. I've invented a new musical technique." Gregor, who had been sharpening knives with violent intensity, paused. "Let me guess. You found a way to play without making noise at all?" "Better." Edwin strummed the rag-stuffed lute, producing a sound akin to a sickly badger coughing. "Hear that? That's progress." Oswin, who had been pretending to sleep, opened one eye. "Still terrible. But lessy terrible." Edwin adjusted the rag with the precision of a master luthier. "If I add more fabric, I might achieve something almost resembling music." Maribel sighed. "Or you might just create a very expensive pillow." Undeterred, Edwin spent the afternoon experimenting. A wool sock produced a dull thump. A wad of hay made the lute sound like it was underwater. A carefully placed chicken feather somehow created a bizarre whistling overtone that made Gregor's teeth hurt. By evening, Edwin had perfected his invention. 2 torn shirts, 1 leather glove, and what might have been a very small pair of breeches stuffed strategically inside the lute's cavernous body. The resulting sound was muted, wobbly, and about 30% less likely to induce nausea in listeners. That night at the inn, Edwin made his grand debut with the muffled lute. He played the Ballad of the Willow Maid, or at least a version of it where half the notes were missing, and the rhythm kept wandering off like a distracted sheep. To everyone's astonishment, the crowd didn't riot. They didn't throw vegetables. Most didn't even cover their ears. A few villagers even tapped their feet, though this may have been due to the strong ale rather than any musical merit. When Edwin finished, there was silence. Then slowly, a smattering of applause. The innkeeper wiped a tear from his eye. That was almost bearable. Edwin bowed deeply, nearly losing his stuffing mid-curtsy. "Thank you, good people. You've witnessed history tonight." Back at their table, Gregor shook his head. "I can't believe that worked." Maribel zipped her ale. "It didn't work. It just failed slightly less spectacularly than usual." Oswin, in a rare moment of verbosity, added, "Still terrible. Just quieter." But Edwin wasn't listening. He was already planning his next innovation, perhaps if he lined the lute with sheepskin, or maybe filled it with moss. The possibilities were endless. As the night wore on and the ale flowed freely, even the skeptical members of the troupe had to admit, Edwin's muffled atrocity of a lute had, against all odds and reason, been deemed acceptable enough to earn them room and board for the week. And in the world of a traveling minstrel who couldn't play, that was as close to victory as one could hope for. Somewhere outside, the judgmental goat bleated what might have been approval, or possibly just indigestion. Either way, Edwin took it as a sign of great artistic promise. Chapter 13. The Unwanted Duet. The town of Willowford had one claim to fame, the annual festival of song, where minstrels from across the kingdom gathered to showcase their talents. The Silver Strings troupe had arrived with modest hopes, intending to perform on the fringes where expectations were low, and ale was plentiful. Edwin, however, had other plans. "Imagine," he declared, gesturing dramatically to the bustling festival grounds, "the glory, the acclaim, the chance to finally prove my musical genius." Gregor snorted. "The chance to finally get us run out of another town, more like." Their argument was cut short by the arrival of the festival organizer, a harried-looking woman clutching a parchment scroll. "You're the Silver Strings?" she asked, eyeing Oswin's mended fiddle with skepticism. Maribel nodded. "We are." The woman scanned her list. "We've paired you with Madrigal the Golden for the afternoon performance." Silence fell. Edwin gasped. "Madrigal the Golden? The legendary soprano?" Gregor groaned. "Oh, this will end well." Madrigal turned out to be every bit as formidable as her reputation suggested. Tall, regal, and possessing a glare that could curdle milk, she took one look at Edwin's cloth-stuffed lute and inhaled sharply through her nose. "This is the musician I'm to perform with?" Edwin bowed deeply. "The very same. May I say what an honor?" "Quiet, don't." Madrigal turned to Maribel. "Can any of you play competently?" Maribel opened her mouth, then closed it. Oswin studied his shoes. Gregor suddenly developed an intense interest in the horizon. Madrigal sighed as if carrying the weight of the world. "Very well. We'll perform the Lay of Lady Brightwater. It's simple enough even for—" She glanced at Edwin. "Beginners." The performance was set for the festival's main stage, a wooden platform adorned with garlands, surrounded by hundreds of expectant faces. Edwin's stomach lurched as he tuned his lute, a process that mainly involved plucking strings at random and hoping for the best. Madrigal took her place center stage, back straight, chin lifted. Edwin shuffled beside her, his lute emitting ominous, creaking sounds. Then the duet began. Madrigal's voice soared like a lark at dawn, pure and effortless. Edwin, meanwhile, plucked at his strings with the rhythm of a man having a seizure. His accompaniment bore only passing resemblance to the actual melody, wandering off at intervals to explore dissonant territories previously uncharted in musical history. The crowd's reaction was immediate. First came the winces, then the confused murmurs. Then, as Edwin hit a particularly unfortunate series of notes during Madrigal's tender bridge, a child began crying uncontrollably. Madrigal's eye twitched, but she soldiered on, her voice growing louder as if to drown out the catastrophe beside her. Edwin, mistaking this for encouragement, redoubled his efforts, strumming with such enthusiasm that one of his fabric mufflers came loose and dangled from the sound hole like a surrendering flag. By the song's final verse, Madrigal was singing through gritted teeth, her knuckles white around her songbook. Edwin, oblivious, finished with a dramatic flourish that sent his remaining plectrum flying into the audience, where it struck a noblewoman directly between the eyes. The silence that followed was the heaviest Edwin had ever experienced. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing in horror. Then, from the back of the crowd, slow, deliberate applause began. A lone figure stood, a white-haired man in rich robes, his face unreadable. The crowd parted as he approached the stage. "Duke Everard," Madrigal whispered, dropping into a deep curtsy. The Duke studied Edwin with unsettling intensity. "That," he said finally, "was the single worst musical performance I have ever witnessed." Edwin opened his mouth to protest, but the Duke continued. "And yet," he mused, "I haven't been so entertained in years." He turned to Madrigal. "My dear, your voice remains exquisite. But this," he gestured to Edwin, "this is something special." Madrigal looked as though she might faint. The Duke smiled. "I want you both to perform at my harvest feast, together." As the crowd erupted in murmurs, Edwin beamed. Madrigal made a small, choked noise. Backstage, the Silver Strings troupe watched in stunned silence as Edwin accepted the Duke's invitation with grandiose gestures. Gregor shook his head. "How does he do it?" Maribel sighed. "The same way a blind squirrel finds a nut. Pure, dumb luck." Oswin, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. "Run," he advised Madrigal as she stormed past, "while you still can." But Edwin, clutching his battered lute and grinning from ear to ear, was already planning their next performance. After all, how much worse could it possibly go? Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, whether in warning or divine laughter. It was hard to say. Chapter 14. The Beggar's Opera. Duke Everard's promised harvest feast never materialized. The invitation, as it turned out, had been less an actual commitment and more a nobleman's drunken whim, a fact the Silver Strings troupe discovered upon arriving at his estate, only to be turned away by confused guards who claimed to know nothing about any musical performance. With their funds depleted from the wasted journey and no other bookings in sight, The troupe found themselves in the bustling but unwelcoming city of Harrow's Gate, where the only stages available were street corners, and the only audience was whoever happened to wander past. Edwin, ever the optimist, took this as an opportunity. "Street performances are the purest form of art," he declared, tuning his battered lute, which now had more stuffing than strings. "No expectations, no rules, just raw, unfiltered creativity." Gregor, who had resorted to juggling knives for passing children in exchange for crusts of bread, didn't bother responding. Maribel was attempting to play her harp while simultaneously guarding it from thieves. Oswin had taken to following Edwin at a distance, possibly to protect him from angry listeners, or possibly to ensure he didn't try to borrow his fiddle again. Edwin chose a promising spot near the fish market. The smell was dreadful, but the foot traffic was excellent. He cleared his throat, struck what he imagined was a professional pose, and launched into his rendition of the Ballad of the Sea King's Daughter. Within moments a small crowd had gathered, though crowd might have been too generous a term. 3 stray dogs, a very old beggar missing most of his teeth, and a disinterested-looking pigeon comprised his initial audience. The ballad, which normally told a tragic tale of love and loss, became under Edwin's fingers something more akin to the sound of a ship breaking apart in a storm while its crew screamed in varying keys. The old beggar winced visibly. One of the dogs howled. The pigeon flew away. Undeterred, Edwin pressed on, pouring his heart into the performance. When he finished with a dramatic flourish which accidentally sent his last remaining plectrum sailing into a barrel of salted herring, he held out his hat expectantly. The beggar stared at him. Then, slowly and deliberately, removed a single copper coin from his own meager collection and placed it on the ground between them. Not in the hat. On the ground. As one might offer payment to avoid being cursed. "My good man," Edwin said, "surely such a moving performance is worth at least 2 coppers. The beggar spat. "I'll give you 2 coppers to stop." A fishmonger's apprentice, having witnessed the exchange, chimed in. "I've heard dying cats make better music." "Ah," Edwin replied, "but have they my artistic flair?" By day's end, Edwin's earnings consisted of 3 copper coins, all clearly given out of pity, a rotten tomato, thrown, and a suggestion from a passing guardsman that he might find more success in another profession. Any other profession? As the troupe regrouped at their makeshift camp beneath the city's western bridge, Edwin remained undaunted. "Tomorrow we'll try the Merchant's Quarter," he announced. "Better crowds there." Maribel, who had at least earned enough to buy them all stale bread, sighed. "Edwin, even beggars won't listen to you play. Maybe it's time to accept that music isn't your gift." For once, Edwin was silent. He plucked a broken string on his lute, producing a dull twang that echoed under the bridge. Even the usual bravado seemed to have left him, if only for a moment. Then, with a sudden grin, he looked up. "You're absolutely right. Music isn't my gift." He stood, pacing excitedly. "Don't you see? All this time I've been trying to fit into your world, but my talents lie elsewhere." Gregor, mouthful of bread, raised an eyebrow. "Do I want to know?" "Storytelling," Edwin declared. "No instruments, no singing. Just words. What could go wrong?" Oswin, who had been sharpening a stick for no apparent reason, snapped it in half with unnecessary force. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. Whether in warning or in relief that the lute playing had stopped, it was impossible to say. Chapter 15. The final performance, hopefully. The troupe arrived in the sleepy village of Milford with the last of their dignity, and a lute that was now more patchwork than instrument. Edwin had spent the entire journey insisting that storytelling was his true calling, though his attempts at dramatic recitation had already resulted in 2 sleeping travelers and 1 very confused sheep. Milford's only tavern, the Gnarled Oakie, was a dim, low-ceilinged place where the ale was weak, but the patrons were weaker, most of them too deep in their cups to care about quality entertainment. It was, in other words, perfect. Mime negotiated a modest payment, half in coin, half in stew, and the troupe set up in the corner beside the perpetually flickering hearth. Oswin tuned his fiddle with quiet precision. Gregor tested the sharpness of his knives, purely for juggling purposes, he insisted. Edwin, however, did not reach for his lute. Instead, he stood before the small crowd, cleared his throat, and spoke. "Tonight, good people of Milford, I shall tell you a tale unlike any you've heard before." His voice boomed with theatrical flourish. "A story of adventure, of peril, He hesitated, realizing he had not actually prepared anything. A drunk farmer squinted at him. "Is this gonna be one of them fancy poems?" Edwin recovered. "Better. This is Gwythe, Ballad of the Black-Handed Bandit." And so he began. It was not, strictly speaking, a ballad, since it contained neither rhyme nor music, but Edwin had never let technicalities hinder his art. He spun a wild tale of a notorious thief who stole not gold, but musical instruments, leaving broken strings and shattered dreams in his wake. At first the crowd murmured in confusion. But then something peculiar happened. Edwin, freed from the constraints of melody and fingering, flourished. His words painted vivid scenes of daring escapes and ill-fated love affairs. He mimed sword fights, dropped his voice to a whisper for dramatic effect, and even improvised a surprisingly moving soliloquy about the bandit's final regret, that he had never learned to play the lute properly. By the time Edwin reached the climax, the bandit's final confrontation with a tone-deaf minstrel who outwitted him with sheer musical incompetence, the entire tavern was leaning forward in their seats. And so, Edwin concluded, spreading his arms wide, the black-handed bandit met his end, not by blade nor arrow, but by the most terrible sound ever to assault mortal ears, a poorly tuned lute played with enthusiasm. Silence. Then the tavern erupted in cheers. Tankards pounded on tables. A few coins clinked into Maribel's outstretched hat. Even the drunk farmer wiped away a tear, though that might have been the ale. Back at their table, Gregor stared. That wasn't terrible. Maribel counted the coins, eyebrows raised. It was almost good. Oswin gave a single solemn nod. The highest praise Edwin had ever received from him. Edwin for once didn't gloat. He just slumped into his seat, exhausted, and took a long drink of watery ale. "I think," he said quietly, "I might be done with music." No one argued. That night, as the troupe bedded down in the tavern's draughty loft, Edwin set his battered lute in the corner. He regarded it for a long moment, its warped frame, its missing strings, the bits of fabric still stuffed inside to muffle his shame. Then he turned away. The next morning, when the troupe gathered their belongings to leave, the lute remained behind, leaning against the hearth like a forgotten relic. Gregor noticed first. "You're not bringing it?" Edwin shook his head. "Some instruments deserve a better fate than me." Maribe smirked. "And some minstrels deserve better than to be chased out of towns with rotten fruit." They left Milford under a clear blue sky, the road stretching ahead of them, uncertain but open. Edwin walked a little lighter without the weight of the lute on his back. And if, years later, tales were told of a wandering storyteller whose words could make kings laugh and beggars weep, well, that was just coincidence. Probably.